1, 2, 3. Morning, Ed. Morning, everyone else. Can I hear anything? I can't hear anything. That's never.
We can hear you fine.
Oh, good. Now I can hear myself. There was a bit of lag there. Look at that, and I get in just in time for 5 o'clock. Sorry, I was making myself my 2 cups of coffee to survive this. So let me just find some slides. Actually, I shall give me 30 seconds just to open all the slides. And then, so, morning everyone. I think given it's 5 o'clock for my time, and let's say 12 o'clock Bangkok time, is probably the easier way to put it. Shall we make a start? Find out how to make Meet Echo, share my slides. No, that doesn't help, does it? That helps. Excellent. Yeah, be nicer if that wasn't quite in that aspect ratio, but there we go. Can everyone see that slide? Just a little bit of.
I can see him. I can see him well.
Excellent. Okay, brilliant. So may as well make a start. Hello, everyone. Rick and Ed here. Welcome to DTN 109. Just to kick off, this session is being recorded because we're on Meet Echo, so it's all being recorded as usual. I'll get to the agenda on the next slide. Standard things, there's a participation guide. Given this is the Friday of this IETF, and I'm assuming most of you have attended other sessions already, you should be fairly familiar with how Meet Echo works. Given you're listening to me, it assumes Meet Echo is working. But the links for how to report technical issues, etc., are also on this slide. But a quick search on the internet using your favorite search provider will also find the usual IETF assistance pages in case of a catastrophic technical breakdown, although how using the internet to solve an internet problem helps, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, so this being an IETF session, it is covered under the Note Well. I hope you are familiar with this. If not, I suggest you read it carefully. It covers all the usual things: behavior, IPR disclosures, copyright, code of conduct, etc. Please take time to read this. But yeah, it's in effect. So the agenda has gone through a couple of updates this week, including some very last minute updates not half an hour ago. So highlights of that are we have moved we are covering in some detail the changes to the drafts that are in IESG review in order to ensure we are getting these issues resolved. This has dragged on for a long time, and we really do have to get these things finished. There have been a list of discusses. I know the authors and the working group have been working quite hard to try and get these cleared. Because of that, we have moved the TCP/CL updates presentation later into the agenda. This is to give Benjamin Kaduk, and I'm sorry if I get your pronunciation of your name incorrect, who is one of the IESG reviewers. It gives him a chance to attend, and actually we can try and get some of these comments addressed at the mic, because doing these things in real time is often quicker than doing them over email. Obviously, everything will always be confirmed on the mailing list because that is a record of decisions made, but the ability to have conversations at the mic should hopefully help us clear up those last issues. The other issue is Yunwon Chung was going to present on his extensions to Profit. That is cancelled, I'm afraid, because there is an IPR issue which we're going to resolve, and hopefully he will be able to present that at the next IETF meeting. So apologies to anyone who came specifically to hear about that. It's not happening. Everyone involved is extremely apologetic because we wanted to, but it's got a bit complex. But that's fine. Okay. A little bit of administrivia. Meetecho can struggle. Apparently there was a denial of service attack on it yesterday for some reason, or on the Jabber part of it. All video conferencing systems have their problems. I personally think Meetecho is a pretty good solution for what we're doing. Please be patient with it. There are a number of just reload the whole site buttons at the bottom right hand corner of your screen. That really helps if your audio breaks up. If not, just reload your whole browser page. As you can understand, there's a lot of people from all over the world trying to use this system. It's running on a cloud provider. Occasionally there are hiccups. Apparently the cloud provider decided to reconfigure half of the virtual network interfaces halfway through the IETF meeting, which caused absolute mayhem, but bless them, they seem to have kept it all afloat. We need minutes taken. The interactive sort of shared, the equivalent of Etherpad, there's a system called CodiMD that is built into Meetecho. We would like to use this for the minutes. Our normal excellent minute taker, Ed, is now, of course, one of our is our new co-chair with me. So we need volunteers to work on keeping the minutes. Please can you use CodiMD? It's a collaborative tool, which means we can all help out and we can all do things such as correct our names when whoever is currently typing has missed or mistyped or whatever. Please don't use it as an opportunity to stick an entire essay underlining your point in extreme detail, but a good capture of what is happening is, of course, useful. And the mailing lists, just to reiterate, dtn@ietf.org. And also, if you need to contact the chairs, unlike my previous typo when asking for agenda items, it is dtnchairs@ietf.org, not itef.org. Although if anyone wants to register that domain and forward it to somewhere useful, I'm sure that will be appreciated. What I will stick in, I should have put a slide in for this. I would like to introduce Ed Brain. A lot of you know Ed. He's been our secretary for a couple of years now. Marc Blanchet has decided to step down as a DTN chair, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him for all his hard work from the inception of this working group all the way through to this current session. I think he's done the working group proud, and his input continues, I know. So a big thank you to Mark. And equally, I'd like to welcome Ed as my new co-chair because he has taken Mark's slot. Congratulations, Ed. Welcome to the mayhem.
Well, no, thank you very much. And I just wanted to echo, the conversations that I'd had with Mark over the years about DTN and understanding its use in a variety of different use cases, terrestrial and in space, have been extremely helpful, and his dedication to making sure that this work continues in a way that makes it correct and implementable and operational is and continues to be appreciated. What I'd like to say otherwise is thank you for the opportunity to come in and help chair the working group, something certainly that we are passionate about. And speaking about being passionate about some of this work, we have been passionately pursuing BPBiz, BPSec, and TCP/CLv4 for really quite some time. And as we have gone through several iterations, and this most recent being the comments from the IESG review, we have gotten to be very, very, very close to finishing the outstanding discusses and comments associated with these documents. The expectation is through the presentations today, we'll be able to understand if there are any remaining questions. Something that is important is even when the documents come out of the working group last call, but then we look at discusses and comments, there are questions that come back to the working group and questions that come back from the mailing list. And we really need to make sure wherever possible that we are engaging in those discussions to make sure that we have time to update and get the drafts in for review, so that by the time the drafts get back onto the ISG telechat, the next one being the 3rd of December, we've made sure that all opinions on some of the open items have been represented. In particular, we've been tracing BPBIS, BPSec, and TCP/CLV4, but something else that we're going to hear about today is the idea that the default security contexts for BPSec really also need to go in front of the ISG to give BPSec and the people who would be approving BPSec the comfort that that we have draft security context that can be operational from day one. And so please pay attention to these 4 documents in particular. And if you do have questions, come to the mic. And if you do have questions, participate on the mailing list as we wrap this up so that we can do this and then get on to our other items that we would like to get to in a recharter.
Here. So yes, this slide is no longer relevant because we were going to discuss this, but unfortunately it's cancelled. So this is the agenda we have. So really, I'm looking at the clock. We should probably kick off with the agenda. We have left 20 minutes for open mic, any other business at the end of the session. That may well be eaten up by overruns. Have no objection to overrunning, particularly on the key documents, as Ed said, that are under IASG review at the moment, as they are really blocking further work in the working group. So we need to get these things sorted. So we'll be fairly lenient with time for the early things, but so I can only apologize to some people who have late agenda items at the end of the agenda. If you get squeezed for time, we will certainly make time for you next time if you get pushed out. So all that being said, Scott, are you here? Yes, you are.
I am.
Ed, do you want to try driving Meet Echo for a second while I find Scott's slides, which are...
I will certainly do my best. This is my first time with the expanded Meet Echo interface. So there are many buttons, and I don't want to, denial of service attack Jabber accidentally.
Okay, so...
You press all the buttons all at the same time, Ed. That is the best way forward.
That is... You've seen me program. All right.
Million monkeys. So I have a quick apology to Scott. I built these slides for him based on an email conversation because of time constraints. So they are A, ugly, and B, a little bit of a stream of consciousness. But on you go, Scott. Just ask me to switch slides for you.
Okay. Everybody can hear me okay? The audio's
Yes.
coming through all right? I'll try to go quickly through this. Next slide. The status of the BPv7 BPBIS bundle protocol specification is this is actually slightly out of date because version 29 of the draft was posted 2 days ago, and it addressed a couple of additional points brought up by Magnus in retiring one of the discusses. So with that in mind, I will try to mention the further updates beyond what's on these slides as we go through them. When I was putting this together, I looked back through the last 4 or 5 months of emails and tried to compile the status of what I understand to be the remaining open questions on the draft. So next slide. This is the big one, and of course it's pretty much unreadable for anybody but me. The big question has been, there's the one that has gotten the most attention, has been whether or not, and if so, how, the BPSec security extensions would be mandated within the BPBIS, the core bundle protocol specification. There was discussion back and forth on this. And I won't go through this extensive email trail. At the end of it, we, I believe, settled on some language that is in the first 2 paragraphs of section 9 of the specification that I believe addresses everybody's concerns and reflects the consensus of people who are on the mailing list. Aside from Mark, who disagreed with the concept entirely, everybody else is okay with there being some element of mandate, and the text of that mandate is written in those first 2 paragraphs of section 9. We can go through those now, but I would propose that we instead press through the rest of this list and then come back to specific questions at the end if there are some.
Scott,
yes.
sorry, Rick interrupting here, sorry. I think it is worth, at the end of this, just reiterating the statement that's in the current, the latest draft, just to make sure that everyone has that understanding of mandatory to, and I'm sorry, it's early for me, mandatory to implement, mandatory to implement, optional to use is the executive summary.
Well,
but
that being the case, why don't I just I'll just
do it now.
Do it now. Do it right now. Okay, so the first 2 paragraphs of section 9, bundle protocol security architecture and the available security services are specified in an accompanying document, the bundle security protocol specification, BPSec. Whenever bundle protocol security services, as opposed to the security services provided by overlying application protocols or underlying convergence layer protocols, are required, those services shall be provided by BPSec rather than by some other mechanism with the same or similar scope. That is, when security is required, BPSec is the way you do it. Second paragraph, a bundle protocol agent which sources, cryptographically verifies, and/or accepts a bundle must implement support for BPSec. Use of BPSec for a particular bundle protocol session is optional. I think that is the language that then Ran Atkinson proposed, and that everybody agreed to, and I'm certainly fine with it. If there are objections to it, it'd be good to bring those out on the mailing list. Good?
Good. Yeah, thank you.
So let's move to the next slide then. Some of these will go very quickly because there have been no comments, but this is one of the open questions that we do need to resolve. There was a discuss on this, and I believe from the last email exchange with Magnus, I believe we've satisfactorily resolved this question. There were a couple of sections in paragraphs in sections 10.3 and 10.4 that were simply removed in version 29 of the specification. So Magnus, do you have a comment at this point?
I just want to clarify, we're back to specification required, and there are experts that are gonna check those when they come in, so there's some chance. So that's basic. By removing the changes, we're actually back to specification required. Yeah. And that's
so. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I take away from the previous discussion and etc. And it's most definitely resolves Alvaro's discuss, even if he hasn't cleared. So. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right. That said, let's move to the next slide. There was a question of, similarly, a question of mandating implementation of the TCP convergence layer, TCP-CL v4 in the BPBIS specification. There is text on that, which I can find if we need to, but I think the gist of it is that we are agreed that implementation of TCP CL is mandatory as a minimum connectivity option for bundled protocol nodes. There was no further discussion on the working group mailing list that I know of. So I'm at this point, I'm taking silence as assent.
I think that's right, Scott. Given the question has been asked on the mailing list, silence is viewed as assent with these things.
Okay. So I'm going to assume that that language is okay. And on the next slide, similarly, there is this question of authorizing bundle protocol agents to override the bundle lifetimes that are asserted by BP applications. And the idea here is to enable a mechanism for congestion mitigation, which was one of the early discuss items that Mirja brought up, to enable congestion mitigation by authorizing bundle protocol agents to essentially delete bundles by changing the bundle lifetime locally, and by using an overriding bundle lifetime for this purpose, we provide a little bit of adjustability to it. You could set it up so that if you're running short on space, maybe you set the bundle lifetime for the purpose of your own as your own bundle node, as your own possession of the bundle. You set it to half an hour. If the bundle has not been forwarded in half an hour, then you authorize it to be deleted as a way of controlling congestion in the network.
So Scott, can I ask a clarifying question here? Because this has slightly confused me. So what you're not discussing here is an intermediate bundle agent altering the lifetime on a bundle before as it forwards it.
Absolutely not.
What you're discussing is a bundle processing agent making a local decision to drop bundles that it knows it's never going to forward because there's congestion.
That's exactly right.
It's a local drop decision rather than an alteration of the bundle's primary block or the bundle's forwarding information.
That's right, and I believe that's very clear in the specification that we're not talking about altering the lifetime of the bundle, which you can't do anyway because it's in the primary block, and that would violate immutability. So it is strictly a local processing decision.
Scott, this is Ed. I had a question about that. When we use this, if we were to delete a bundle by advancing or changing or overriding its bundle lifetime, and a reason code would be generated as an administrative record showing that the bundle had been deleted for this purpose, would the reason code be that the lifetime was expired, or would it be something else? We've
sort of gone back and forth on that. I believe what the specification says now is that the reason code would be, I forget exactly what the word is, but it's traffic cleansed or something. Let me see if I can.
But your point is
that
it would be differentiable from a normal lifetime expiration.
Yes, it would be.
Okay.
Good.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Then let's go on to the next slide. This is whether or not the language in 41511 is a satisfactory specification of the DTN scheme endpoint ID syntax that enables a bundle protocol agent to differentiate between a DTN scheme endpoint that is singleton and one that is that has multiple, or potentially has multiple members in the endpoint. And the mechanism proposed for that is for the DMUX portion of the endpoint ID beginning
Okay. Mm-hmm.
this is another one where there was some discussion on the mailing list. And the core question here is, and this has come up in a number of contexts, bundle protocol time values, such as bundle creation time, lifetime bundle age, has been denominated in seconds. And there's been this objection that, oh no, it needs to be in milliseconds because for some purposes, we need finer grained decision making on the basis of time. We considered several alternatives: seconds, nanoseconds, microseconds, milliseconds. Milliseconds seems to be and how do we guarantee that it really is immutable when there's when it's, at least in theory, possible to change from one valid CBOR representation of time to another CBOR representation of time that is equally valid but has a different number of bytes. In draft 29, I inserted text to the effect that all CBOR representation values in and bundle protocol blocks needs to be in canonical.
So Rick here again. What was the decision, milliseconds or seconds? Okay.
and it's I believe a small increase in transmission overhead. So I think I think the value outweighs the cost.
If I remember correctly from the discussion, the reason people were keen on milliseconds was not so much for the delay tolerant aspect, but for disruption tolerant aspects. So you might have very fast networks which are constantly disrupted. So in those fast transmission networks, milliseconds make a lot of sense. As compared to the space use case where seconds is fine. I think that was the argument.
That's right. It's particularly useful for low Earth orbiting satellite operations, for example. Yeah.
Just as a side note, MeetEcho has a queue. If anyone has any comment, please jump to the queue now rather than waiting right until the end of the presentation. I think it's worth, because some of these questions are complex and there's a few outstanding questions. So if you're hanging back to ask all your questions in a big rush, I have no objection to you stepping on the queue now.
Okay. We can discuss this some more if anyone has points to bring up. But in the meantime, I would propose we move on to the next slide. How should we do this? Adam is in the queue now.
I went into the queue because I saw that there was some discussion in the chat from.
I'm not watching the chat.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So there was some discussion from Stu on the dropping thing a little while ago that I added to the Cody. But Will asked a question right before you said something about the queue, and I waited for him to hopefully get in the queue. He didn't, so I stepped in the queue. So Will, if you don't mind, I'll just vocalize your question. Was there a discussion of a variable denomination scheme?
Oh,
too nervous to ask.
Right. So there was some discussion on the mailing list of being able to vary the denomination of time values in the course of end-to-end transmission, maybe changing from seconds to milliseconds. Primary block immutability, and so it was not going to be okay. That is, changing from seconds to milliseconds en route from the source to destination was not going to be an okay option. I would go a little further, and for purposes of simplicity, I would endorse the idea that all times throughout the
just a quick comment. Will on the chat said, "I'm sorry, I'm wasting everyone's time." You're not, Will. That's the point of these things. There's no such thing as a stupid question.
I'm just stepping in again. I know because I know Stu can actually talk. I talked to him earlier. Does he want to step up and go to the mic to ask his questions on the drops of the bundles? Because he did ask a question there. And I don't know if we want to just backtrack back to that real fast, or if we
Sure.
wanna,
That's fine.
Stu, do you want to step up and ask that question?
I think Ed answered it adequately in the chat window. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll flip back to the, I've changed slides. There we go. So
BPBIS specification should be mandatory or conditional. Extension blocks where they're needed, and omit them where they're not needed. So I'm personally opposed to make that are defined in the BPBIS specification mandatory on all bundles.
sorry, Scott. This is Rick again. Sorry, the mandatory question again. This is mandatory to implement, optional to use. Am I correct?
I think this is from a comment. I think it may have been one of Benjamin's comments that some of these extension blocks seem important enough that they ought to be mandatory in all bundles. And I would interpret that as meaning that they would be mandatory to use as well as mandatory to implement.
Yes, I do believe this was a question that was raised in one of my comments, and the intent I had in my comment was more along the lines of, can we ensure that if I put this extension in, I can be confident that the other end will understand it. So that would be the sort of mandatory to implement, but not mandatory to include in every bundle sense.
Whether that ought to be moot because all nodes should understand and be able to process these defined extension blocks is that's a valid question.
Rick here. What I get confused by the word extension because for some protocols, extension is used to describe a mechanism that additional functionality, possibly not described in the original specification, can use. So extending a protocol to add features that you might require for your enterprise or your deployment, as compared to where I think we use the word extension in BPBIS to mean flexible extra blocks that are optional to have within a bundle. And I wonder whether
Yes.
that terminology confuses people. So traditionally, an extension would be optional to implement, i.e. you implement it if you support the extension, and the extension would be specified in some way. Whereas a bit like IP header fields, they are mandatory to understand and defined, but optional to use, if you understand my analogy. And I wonder
So I'm glancing back at section 4.3 in the spec. The language here is really silent on whether implementation of support for these extension blocks is mandatory. It is clear that that the presence or absence of the blocks is optional, subject to some constraints. So I'm at the moment, I think the language is correct about the presence or absence of the blocks. If we want to add some language that says that these extension blocks must be implemented, that is the ability to handle these particular extension blocks is mandatory, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to add to the start of 4.3.
Yeah, on the chat, Mark Blanchet correctly points out that given this is a very disconnected network protocol, we can't have a negotiation protocol between the two endpoints to negotiate extensions and capabilities. Therefore, we need to make extensions mandatory to implement. But that could create an issue in the future, as new extensions could then require implementations to become non-conformant in some way. So I agree with him on this. There's a difference between future extension of BP-BIS to add capabilities that may not exist in existing implementations, which is different from, here are some extra blocks that may appear in your bundle, but you must be able to handle them if you see them. And I think, okay, action for the working group on this. Please can people double check this section and ensure that it meets your understanding of what's needed here. I'll make a note of that, and I'll get that on the mailing list.
And Adam is in the queue again.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said up to this point. I think I don't like to make terminology when we don't need to. But you pointed out a good thing, Rick, where the word extension means something extending the protocol, and it's being used here as, oh yeah, it's kind of a flexible thing that may or may not appear in the bundle. So the word extension, I think, is the problem. Maybe we change that word and we use a different word. There's got to be a word somewhere that describes exactly what is happening with these structures. What I'm saying.
I think if we wanted to do that, I think we would add a term rather than replacing the term, because there are, it sounds like there are what we're currently calling extension blocks that are mandatory to implement. And then there are additional extension blocks that cannot be made mandatory to implement in this specification because nobody's defined them yet.
And I think we need to discriminate between the two. And I think the best way to discriminate is to name them differently. So,
well, I would propose that we don't necessarily have to do that if we don't want to introduce additional terminology. And I actually agree with Adam that introducing additional terminology, willy-nilly is often a bad idea. What we say currently is extension blocks are all blocks other than the primary and payload blocks, which is very clear. We can say in 4.3 that those extension blocks which are defined in this specification, implementation of support for those extension blocks is mandatory. And just leave it at that.
Go ahead, Magnus.
Yeah, I would support Scott here. I think that's the way of least risk of introducing other changes, etc., to rather explicitly name those blocks so we don't get, because we are in the late stages, and I would like to avoid having large sweeping changes in the document at this point.
Okay, so I'm watching the clock here. Ronald in the chat makes a very valid point, which is extension block is a well-known term in this DTN, in the DTN IETF work. So those of us inside DTN do understand what an extension block is. But I think for fresh readers to the BPBIS, we need to make sure that that terminology is correctly defined and the rules for implementers is there. But we'll move on, if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Switch back to the slides. No, clicked in the wrong window. Oh, come on. Oh, that's the last slide.
Oh, that's the last? Okay,
That's
great.
the last slide. Sorry, I didn't put a final slide on. Laziness.
Okay.
So you've overrun by
Magnus is
quarter of
still
an
in the
hour.
queue?
Go ahead, Magnus.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I think we have to take this to the list because we've got a full agenda, and I was happy to let that overrun, but I'm looking at the clock.
Okay.
So
So at this point, we have one remaining residual question, which is this one, and the proposed cure for it being, I think, adding some text in a sentence in 4.3. And I would propose to leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to propose that on the list, Scott, and just make sure we've got agreement from the working group on that,
Yeah.
that would be great.
I'll do that, and I will now mute myself.
Thank you very much. So next we have, I'm
Just to
juggling
say
through
something.
slides. It's
While
BPSec.
you're jumping through the slides, Rick, I'm just going to say one thing.
Sure.
During that little conversation we just had there, because I got involved speaking, I did miss a couple bits of it. If you can if people can capture that into the Cody, that would be wonderful, because I did miss bits and pieces of that because I was speaking and it was hard to switch back and forth. Just so everyone is aware.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it's a good point. What are we on? BPSec updates. I think this is the right slide. So, the problem with Meet Echo is I can't see my slides and see. Oh no, it's BP's. Yeah, I can't see my slides and Meet Echo at the same time, which is confusing.
Yeah, I think you're showing the security context, but we
I
want
am.
to go through the BPSec
I'm showing
update first.
Stop.
And
Wake up,
while you're
Peter.
getting the slides up, Rick, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank
Excellent.
you. Oh, this is the right. These are the right slides. I didn't
Excellent,
upload
yes.
these. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it here. So really just a quick overview of where we're at with BPSec. We have one outstanding discuss item that is teed up primarily for discussion here today. And that's regarding mandatory security contexts. And at this point, we believe that to be addressed with the current version of BPSec, which is version 24. So if you flip over to the next slide.
Is that? Yeah, it is doing it. Yeah.
Perfect. So this is an update from what Ed presented at the last meeting at 108. I captured all of the questions that he spoke to, just highlighting some of the updates made and identifying whether or not there's some functional changes between 22 and 24. So the bolded items there are the ones that I'm going to be discussing in the rest of the slide deck. The items that are not bolded, there are obviously no changes at all, no changes made at all. So we left those alone and those won't be discussed here. So with that, we'll jump into the first topic there, which is mandatory to implement security contexts. So the next slide there. So perfect. Should there be one security context that's considered mandatory to implement for all BPSec implementations? Previously, there was no mandated security context. However, based on previous discussion and discussion on the mailing list, the current version, we've put in an update there to mandate support at a minimum for the default security contexts, which is going to be discussed in the next presentation that we have teed up here. It also maintains the requirement that was in 24, maintains the requirement that was in 22, that implementations must support security contexts within the networks that they're operating. So that's above and beyond minimum, should they exist, to make sure that all nodes and all nodes in the network are able to understand and comprehend and operate with those security contexts. So with that, I'll take a pause here and open it up for any discussion or questions.
I would just put in the comment that I think this text here was drafted by Ran Atkinson on the mailing list and brought in based on what he felt was a parallel construction from some of his other security work.
Yes, thanks, Ed.
Can I add a thank you to Ran, who's been really supportive on this and actually really helpful with some of this security terminology work. So if you're dialed in, Ran, thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Okay,
next
if
slide.
there's nothing further, next slide, please. All right, thank you. So one of the open questions that was previously discussed was whether or not we would be allowing nested signatures and having multiple signatures nested within a security operation. So there were no functional changes that we made since 22. BPSec 24 adds that this capability should be implemented through a custom security context and/or custom security blocks. So, kind of putting that outside of the mainline implementation and specification here in BPSec, but allowing the flexibility should those needs arise.
I can speak to that also for a moment. That we were getting questions related to the idea that if a bundle was going through a network and every node in the network wanted to provide its own signature over a particular security target, what do you do in that case? If you have many bibs all pointing to the same security target, that's not allowed in BPSec. And the reason it's not allowed in BPSec is because it becomes a nightmare for verification afterwards and should not be allowed. And so we made it clear here that if there is some, I'll use the term madness, that needs to be done here, then the behavior of it really should just be encapsulated inside of a single security context where they allow multiple security results to be added if they needed to that single bib that would exist to capture those results. But otherwise, one, it's a bad idea, and two, BPSec is not going to support it out of the box.
Ed, adding a follow-on comment. So in the multi-signature scenario or the multiple verification scenario, the assumption is that in the definition of the security context that does this operation, the verification methods and all the problems associated with it will of course be solved in that specification, therefore avoiding BPSec having to go down that rabbit hole.
Yes, and I think what Ken will show in the next slide, in the next presentation, is that security context can have processing behavior as part of the definition of the context.
Okay.
All right, so if there's nothing further, let's go to the next slide, please.
Mhm.
Thank you. So the topic here for discussion was somewhat similarly considering whether or not we should be considering signature encryption over multiple blocks. Again, taking the same path here and making no functional change from 22 into 24, and instead adding language to recommend implementation through a custom security context. Staying with the design paradigm that we want, we want that madness, as Ed says, to be kind of outside of the mainline implementation. And again, I've got the text from the from 24 there for specifically referring to the bib pieces, but it's similar for both.
I must admit, I'm a huge fan of reducing potential madness opportunities, so I, in general, support this. I think actually one of the legitimate criticisms of some of the early BPSec drafts was it was so flexible that it was entirely conceivable to tie yourself in knots, and from an implementer perspective, it looked like such a tough target to try and get your implementation correct because of such options. I'm a huge fan of security contexts. I think they solve a lot of this problem.
Okay. If there's nothing further, next slide there. Okay. So this topic here was asking, proposing that we add bundle protocol reason codes. Again, because there's new reasons that a bundle might, or a node might discard a bundle. So within BPSec 24, there are 5 new reason codes that are added, and recommends that those reason codes be allocated within the existing bundle status report reason codes registry. So if there's nothing further, we'll go on to what I believe is the last slide here. And in a similar vein there, should BPSec be reserving some security context parameter and result IDs to promote commonality? The change in BPSec 24 is to set negative values as reserved for local and on-site specific use within the security context identifier registry. So again, the only change here is adding those negative values as being reserved.
So there, I had two quick comments on that. Number one, there's actually a typo in BPSec where this registry is defined as an unsigned integer, meaning the values less than 0 are right back to madness. But so presumably we would change that to a signed value. And then this particular suggestion came from Benjamin and Kaduk. And so if there were any other discussions or areas where that had been useful or not, it certainly seems reasonable to me and would be happy to include it.
Rick here, my only comment would be this doesn't seem to follow the pattern of registered identifiers in BPBIS, where small values are specification required and larger values are private use. I do understand that this is that the local site specific use cases are not so much experiments, which is commonly where private use reserved flags are used. They could be production grade used in anger, hence keeping the bit count low has some advantage. I wonder what other people think. It's just a comment about using a negative value, which seems unusual, but I can see reasons. Perhaps that's just me.
So I know that I have no strong opinion on it. Is there instead a value saying something to say, the first 10 values or the first 20 values instead are reserved for local use? I see Brian up in the queue now.
what
Go
it's
ahead, Brian.
worth, for what it's worth, the investigation I've been doing into COSI and some other uses of CBOR for this kind of thing does use positive and negative values, similar
okay.
to what you're talking
Fine.
about.
Fine. In which, yeah, that's fine. I can see some benefits, so yeah, okay. I was the point of my question was trying to avoid getting all the way to IANA assignment and someone in IANA saying, this isn't the way we usually do things, can you go back and change it? So as long as there's prior art, let's stick with it. Next slide.
Okay. And that should be
That's
it
it
for me.
Yeah. Thank you, Ken. I will roll straight into your next presentation because it follows directly from there.
Perfect. Thank you.
And find the other one now, which is, why has it moved all my tabs around? This is the right one. So you titled them both the same.
Yes. But yep, you've got it here. So again, we'll go ahead and jump into this one. So here we're talking about the updates to the default security context, as the companion document to BPSec. So if you jump into the summary slide next, please. So the takeaway and kind of what to be looking for in this presentation is in the update that Ed made from the -01 to -02. There's a lot of additions to provide more flexibility and more specificity in the security context, and leaves a little bit less up to the imagination for the implementer. So it adds detail to the security context that already exists. So that's the HMAC and SHA-2 bib, as well as the AES GCM BCB security context. And as a reminder, for the AES GCM BCB, that provides a integrity mechanism as well as a encryption and decryption mechanism. And so in each of those security contexts, the following are added. So support for multiple key lengths, definition of a security context scope to identify what the inputs are to the operations, canonicalization algorithms for the inputs to help specify the exact order in which those are processed, and then finally updated security context parameters that are added into to accommodate these new features. So with that, we'll step through each of those things in the following few slides. So one of the big changes in the default security context document was the addition of the ability to specify multiple key lengths within these security contexts. So previously it was a specified fixed value. However, adding in that flexibility to support multiple key lengths allows you to streamline the definition of the context, yet add flexibility for the implementations. So you can select 256-bit key or all the way up to 512 for the bib security context, and then for BCB likewise, anything ranging from 128-bit all the way up to 256-bit. And those follow directly from definitions in RFC 8152. So I'll take a quick pause here and offer it up for any comments or thoughts. All right. If there's nothing further, let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So another addition here was more definition for the scope of each of the security contexts. So here the scope refers to the set of information used as input for each of the security operations, and those are spelled out here. I'm not going to go into the detail of those, but for each of the security contexts defined in the default security context document. The primary block, security target other fields, including some of the the content listed in the text there, as well as other fields that are spelled out there. These are all selectable targets that can be used, specified in the scope as the scope for the inputs. And again, that allows more flexibility when it comes to the implementation and the actual employment of these security contexts, and without requiring new security contexts for every single possible configuration that someone would want to use.
I just had a point of clarification to this, that there were, this was based on the mailing list, an observation that Brian Sipos had made about, for example, how would you cryptographically bind a block to the bundle in which it should exist. Certainly one thing that you could do would be include the individual signature of the primary block as a secondary result with the bib, but then you're carrying two signatures around, and that seems to be extra work and extra bytes. And by including the primary block in the set of information provided and calculating a single signature over the normal target and perhaps these other optional targets, that will have the same function of binding it all together, and then you're only carrying one signature.
Okay. If there's nothing further, let's go on to the next slide here. Thank you. So here, this is mostly included for completeness. This is obviously a copy and paste from the document itself. Again, kind of talking to canonicalization algorithms. So for the integrity protection security context, there's a canonicalization algorithm defined that in order to specify how the canonical forms of the components of the bundle specified by the scope parameters are appended and formed together as an input to the security operation. So there's a well-defined operation, processing flow defined there. So starting with an empty set of length 0, there's essentially a series of if statements, and depending on what is specified as the input scope, first it will take the canonical form of the primary block, append that to the IPPT. Next up, it will look at the security header flag. Let's see, security header flags and various flags there. Let's see. Apologize for being a little bit lost in the text here, but essentially it goes through again, looks at all of the integrity scope parameters specified, computes the canonicalized form of each of those, and sequentially appends those in a well-defined order. So with that, I'll take a pause if there's any questions, comments, thoughts. All right. So with that, we'll flip over to the next slide, talking about the BCB AES GCM input canonicalizations. Generally, those follow right after exactly what's defined for the integrity protection mechanisms. So looking for the BCB AES GCM security context, there's an encryption process, a decryption process, and then a integrity check that can be performed on that as well. So for the canonicalization of the plain text used during the encryption, it's some language there right from the document as well to specify how that's presented as an input there. Likewise, for decryption, the ciphertext is formatted in a similar way, well-defined way, to be passed into that processing. And then for the integrity calculations against the additional authenticated data, that follows essentially just as previously shown in the integrity protection mechanisms.
Okay, so sorry, Rick here. A thought occurred to me while reading that, which was, why is this text not in BPSec itself? So, but I think I know the answer to that.
So,
from my perspective, the answer is that by specifying it in the security context, it allows you to introduce a new security context that may be using the same encryption primitives, but a different canonicalization algorithm. Is that correct?
So this is, it's definitely, you know, from my perspective, it seems to be, you know, oriented that way, right? So that way you can have flexibility in terms of how you implement the processing, how you implement your formatting in such a way that makes sense for a given security context that you might want to implement that would be different than this one. So by not putting this in the main, you know, BPSec, again, we're not tying the BPSec to have a specific implementation.
Mm-hmm.
So Rick, an example of that would be context, if someone really wanted to do this, where they would portion out and encrypt only portions of the target as opposed to the entire thing, and get into, you know, encryption ranges and blocking off different the plain text. And that's just not something that should be in BPSec. It's also not something that should be in a default security context. Maybe it shouldn't be anywhere, but if it needs to be somewhere, it would be in its own document.
Understood. Yeah.
Okay. If there's nothing further, we can go on to perhaps my last slide if my memory serves. So with the above changes, there are additional security context parameters that are added in that you know, really capture all of the different aspects there. So the SHA variant, again, kind of speaking towards used to identify which of the different key lengths, which of the variants to be used, encapsulated key to be able to transfer some key information, and then the integrity scope flags, which are used to identify which portions of data are to be used for the input canonicalization algorithms to then be processed by the security context. And likewise, for the BCB AES GTM context, you have similar information as well as an initialization vector that's used. That parameter was already present in the previous version, so the following 3 items are new adds with the O2 version. So if there's nothing further, I think that was my last slide, and I'll turn it over.
Yes, it is.
My last comment on this is, as we look at getting the core 3 documents through IESG, the BPSec document has a single discuss against it from Mira, and that is that there needs to be an approved set of default security contexts to go with it. So this document and the security context -02 does need to get a nice review before it goes out. It is in working group last call. If you have not read it or read the new version, please this week take some time and go through it and provide comments on the mailing list.
And equally, we will be needing a document shepherd for this as well, so that we can complete all our checks and balances before pushing it to the ISG. Magnus, go ahead.
Button to press. Yes, but if it's, I don't think it, I mean, all discusses that are for ADs to step down is not in force, so to say. So it's don't get fooled by that. If the name of the discuss holder is in parentheses, it's actually not in force. And so it's I think we're in ADs. We're using part of the data tracker where maybe you don't see the summary graphics, etc., which actually correctly summarize it. It's green or red, etc. And you may looking mostly at the our evaluation page for the individual document and the evaluation record, and that's might give you that misconception that they discuss is active. So,
Okay.
But it's probably not blocking. But I mean, we still need to make progress on this because that question of dependency need to be dealt with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a quick agenda change because we have reshuffled so that Ben Kaduk could get involved with the TCPCL conversation. He has multiple clashes today. He's asked that we bring TCPCL in as the next item rather than the cozy contexts. I am very sorry to juggle everyone around, but we really need Ben and Brian to talk about TCPCL together. So I'm going to shuffle everything around once more. Brian, are you happy to present now? I'm really hoping you're not getting a coffee. Yeah, he's there. Right, I'll find the slides.
And as far as the slides are concerned, this should be relatively short in terms of presentation content. It may take a little bit of time to discuss.
No, I've got to find the slides because I appear to have had a competency failure. Sorry. Cozy slides, that's it. No, not cozy slides.
TCP.
TCP, stop sharing the wrong window. Share the right window. I'm sorry. I got up at 4 a.m. Hold on. That's because it's called, but you've named your slides BPSec Cozy Contexts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what's confused me. There we go. It's fine. These are, I assume, the slides.
Yes.
Good. Okay, cool. Go
okay,
ahead,
so go into the next slide. So the first two slides are a bit of boilerplate. The goals are exactly the same as they have been. A rough amount of backwards compatibility, but adding in new extensibility and interoperability. So next slide, please. There were two main sources of changes from the last draft, and there's even a further 23 revision. And these are feedback from Ben Kaduk and feedback from Martin Duke. And the good news is this is not changing the structure of TCPCL, not changing the encodings of things in a fundamental way. Ben's feedback has really been focused on the PKI and the TLS aspects of the convergence spec. And it's going a long way to solidify things and make things interoperable is the goal here, and also usable with the current PKIX tools and tooling that's available. So this is still, there are a few issues remaining to be worked out, and I have another slide later on that I can talk about, but it's really nailing down specifics about how to make TCPCL behave in a way that is in agreement with best current practices and in agreement with other protocols using the same types of mechanisms or the same mechanisms. There's some terminology changes, again, just to be clear about when an IP address is being named versus a DNS name. And this is, again, pulling TCPCL closer in line with other specs covering the same ground. I added a clarification based on Scott Burley's comment about how do existing implementations handle if I ask to make contact with node A and they respond, I'm node B, what should the behavior of the convergence layer be? And that is continue on with a warning, basically. the bundles must continue to flow. And Martin Duke's feedback did lead to one change, and that's the addition of a transfer refuse reason. And this is something that really was an oversight from earlier, that when it comes to cleanly shutting down a TCP/CL session, there's a period of time when you can't accept new transfers because you're shutting down. That's the whole point of having that clean termination procedure. So one of these refusal reasons is, I am terminating. Your bundle is perfectly fine, but don't send it to me right now in this session because I'm terminating. So that distinguishes it from the other refusal reasons, which is more to do with your bundle's malformed, or I've run out of disk space, something like that. If you can go to the next slide. So that covers what's in 22, and some of this is also changes in 23 focused on the PKI aspects of things. I am planning on doing, so this first topic of how to define the use of CAN-TLS contact header flag. After looking at what Ran and Ben had been discussing on the mailing list, I want to take that terminal, that verbiage that they had narrowed in on. I think this is an appropriate thing to do, in the sense that it changes the language from "you can speak TLS" to "your entity is configured to use TLS." It's a minor, from the spec, it's a minor change, but it brings it more in line with, and I've also added to the security considerations an explicit piece of text that's going to be in the upcoming revision. And this is something that maybe Scott might want to look at eventually also, in the sense of, it says explicitly, it says the phrase mandatory to implement but optional to use, and with a little bit of explanation of what does that mean. So you could steal that for something like BPSec or those extension blocks. But that's, like I said, it's in an upcoming draft. So I think that CAN-TLS should at that point be put to rest. The one comment that came in from, I believe it was from Martin, about a supported version set. This is something that hadn't been discussed prior. It's not something that had been present in the previous TCP/CL. The concept is, in some protocols, you can say, I don't support version 3, but I do support version 4 and 2. The next contact, please use one of those versions. The current spec, the way it operates is you start at the top of your list, latest revision, and you work down. So there's a risk that if you're talking about just pure open network, anybody talking to anybody, the risk is it takes you 2 or 3 failed connection attempts to negotiate a shared version. I don't necessarily see a problem with that. It's a question to working group. If it seems like it's worth adding complexity to the contact header. Right now, the contact header is short and fixed length. And this would just add a little bit of complexity to the contact header. So I'm not sure that there's much value in this for the use cases that are known on this. There was a suggestion to add 2 different contact failure reason codes, which is version too high and version too low, instead of simply version mismatch. That seems to be a little bit more reasonable.
So Brian, Rick here. I'm displaying my lack of knowledge on TLS here, but does the TLS handshake itself not have a failed completely because you're trying TLS version 1.1 and I only support version 1.3? I mean, can we
This is even more
TLS?
fundamental. This is a TCP/CL version.
Okay, sorry.
I'm speaking version 4, you're speaking version 3. We need to negotiate a common version. So it's the top level, what is being communicated on this port.
Okay. I may have some ideas. I won't interrupt now, but I'm just thinking. Yeah, I need to think them through. But okay, I'll make a personal note.
For the near
I'll think
term,
about that.
for the near term, my plan is to not touch the contact header. Leave this as an open item.
Just rather than being cryptic, my preference would be an error response which says something like upgrade. I understand you're trying to talk TCP/CL version 3. I am a v4 implementation. Go away, but please upgrade. I've implemented just enough TCP/CL version 3 to give you that return code.
So that was the one alternative that was proposed in the comment, was to have two different failure responses, which is version 2 high and version 2 low, so you'd know which way to try your next attempt.
I wouldn't bother with version 2 high.
Well, right now the workflow is very simple in that you start at the latest version that you are capable of and work down from there.
Yeah.
So it's deterministic at least, but it might be wasteful.
Yeah, I assume we're optimizing for the case where both ends actually know the versions and have made contact previously and have some idea that so we don't, the version mismatch I don't think is on the critical path for these things, but it does need to be specified. Okay.
Yes, and it's also, I mean, it could be kicked down to say, well, this is a mechanism, the discovery mechanism kind of a thing to take care of. To tell the world what version I'm running.
So my problem with version 2 high, and I don't want to take too much time, is how do I know what header TCPL version 6 has? How do I know it's version 6 when I'm version 4 and version 6 doesn't exist yet?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, yeah.
So I understand that it's sort of, I have no idea what you're talking about. Seems to be a fairly valid reason code, or possibly even just killing the TCP connection. You sent me something which looks like garbage to me, which is different from you've sent me something I understand as a TCPL version 3 header.
Mm-hmm.
So version 2 low, I can implement that. Version 2 high, I'm predicting the future. But let's take this offline.
Okay.
And
so the current behavior is not going to be changed, at least in the near term, is the takeaway here. The last topic has been augmented a little bit from some feedback from Ben. The question was, is there a need or value to having a PKI extended key usage allocated for, in some way or another, DTN? And the reason for this is currently I can take a certificate that somebody issued to me for my HTTP server, for my LDAP server, whatever, and I can repurpose that and use it for TCP/CL, no problem. I keep my host name, it's the same, and now I'm talking TCPL using the same cert. So it's a question of, is this a desirable behavior? And the follow-on question that's not on the slide is, and I'm going to be doing some communicating with the expert on the OID for the IANA, which is, does it make sense to have two different levels of this is a DTN transport purpose versus a DTN bundle security purpose? Or is there simply one level of this is a valid user of DTN security at some level, trust them?
So is the question here about enforcement? So as one side of a TLS connection, when I get to the I want to verify my peer's certificate or my peer's cert check, I can look at the extended key usage OID on the certificate that was used to establish this connection. And at that point, I can make a local decision over whether I want it or not. So your question is, should the spec say, you must check the EKU, and if it is not this special reserved for use by TCP/CL auth, you must terminate? That's your question. I'm being sort of Postel principle of accept, but with control. So if I was
the way that other
yeah.
protocols make use of this kind of thing, other modern protocols, is to say, if the certificate does have an EKU, it must contain this value. So if a CA just says, you are a valid holder of this name, do what you will, then that'll be accepted. But if a CA says, you're a valid holder of this name, and it's intended to be used for OCSP, if it's intended to be used for NTP, if it's intended to be used for something that's not DTN, then don't accept it for DTN. Because the idea is the CA issued it for something else. Should you be trusting it for DTN?
I would be happy with should terminology for this.
Yeah.
Because I can see, particularly in constrained devices, having 101 certificates just differing over EKU values for effectively the same device is just a pain.
The way that it's specified, or the way that it is or will be specified, is as a recommended security policy. So the requirements are, if the security policies are so-and-so, here's how you act. And then there's a separate statement, is the recommended security policy is X, Y, and Z. So
okay, yeah,
that's the idea.
Yeah, I'd be happy with that. I need to reread TCP/CL. Personal note.
Yeah. So the good news is it's converging, and Ben, if he wants to chime in, can talk about that.
I just wanted to say a little bit about extended key usage values in general. I mean, you're quite correct that the CAs will sometimes just not have any EKU at all, but then other times they will have some. And the sort of idea there is that the CA is bothering to specify in detail what the certificate is intended to be used for. And you can tell that because there's any extended key usage present in the certificate at all. And so now that you know that the CA has some intent or some information about what the certificate should be used for, then you are sort of constrained by the list of key usage values. And there could be more than one. You could have a single certificate that is valid for both CSP and HTTP and DTN. It would be somewhat unusual to do that, but it's certainly valid within the protocol. So I think my suggestion here would be to, yes, define the extended key usage value and say that if you receive a certificate that has EKU, then you should check for this one, but we don't need to have a very strong requirement that if you have a certificate, you should have a certificate that has this EKU value. I think the way that the current ecosystem is set up, it's not guaranteed that, or it's not necessarily going to be very easy to get a certificate that has this particular EKU value. So I think if we tried to insist that everybody had it, that would basically result in everybody violating the spec. And so there's not much reason for us to write something that we know will be ignored.
Must, but we know you won't. I'm watching the clock here, guys. Yeah. So, sorry, keep going. This is important.
I was just going to say, in that sense, the recommended security policy is a little bit aspirational, but it's realizable.
Sounds good. I don't think I had anything else to say. So I think we're in pretty good shape.
That's the last slide as well. Any questions?
So, my intent is to publish another revision, and maybe this will wrap things up.
I hope so. And thank you again to the chairs for changing the schedule around so that can be
fine. So I'm conscious we've got half an hour left. and we have 3 10-minute presentations. So for the sake of people following you, can I ask people to be timely? Let me find the other slide called BPSec Cozy Contexts, which is not not these slides, because it's still Brian. Is that right, Ed? I can't see the agenda in front of me.
Sorry, yeah, the next one is the Cozy Context with Brian.
Okay. Brian, you have, let's say 7 minutes.
Okay. Yep. So the short takeaway here, if you skip to the next slide, you can skip the first 2. They're just background on what the intent here is. But really the goal here is PKI and PKI with existing mechanisms. So if you flip to the third slide. The last draft now introduces one single security context with one context ID. And the intent here, there can be some feedback on this for if this makes sense, but the idea is that the structure of whether it's used in integrity or confidentiality is exactly the same. What's different is what types of messages will be embedded in the results. So having one context or having 2 contexts, it really doesn't structurally change what is being represented here. But the idea is that the context is parameters are some key materials, public key materials. Results are COSI messages. An integrity result either has a MAC or a signature or some future COSI message that's going to do that job. And the confidentiality result has an encrypt message in it. And the reason for COSI itself can transport public keys with the individual results. The reason for having them in security parameters is that if I choose to sign every single block in my bundle and I have 15 different results, I don't want to have 15 different copies of my public key. So the parameters have the public key and then the results have the key identifiers that reference that public key. So it's relatively clean in that structure. And then each result is a COSI message, and this is dipping toes into that realm that Ed had mentioned of getting into a little bit of madness of structure. COSI is quite vast and can get complex. There is in this document, if you flip to the next slide, there is a COSI profile that narrows down exactly what is reasonable to have in these kind of security results. And that is, there are required symmetric key algorithms for MAC, for encryption, and for key wrap. And there's recommended the asymmetric public key stuff. So this nails it down at least to a realizable and implementable set of things that you can do. And it also restricts that you can't have arbitrary depth nested messages, all kinds of complicated stuff. And the last draft also has examples of using this kind of stuff. So it is realizable if you wanted to start implementing something like this. The good news is that the COSI ecosystem is present. There are COSI encoders and decoders right now. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to be interoperable, but it's something that's already in motion. So if you flip to the next slide. Then this is similar to what was presented for those interoperability contexts for BPSec, that COSI, this profile requires authenticated encryption with additional data. It requires certain structure that COSI doesn't mandate about all this context data that's coming out of the bundle, that's coming out of the primary block or the block header of the target block. So that's what this profile nails down, is how COSI fits into the BPSec environment. And the one last statement is just that COSI natively has this concept of a protected header versus unprotected header. What gets secured, what gets nailed down, and what's not what's potentially allowed to change. And this carries through with that same concept. So the security parameters for this context are not part of the protected data. If you flip bits in the parameters, what you'll end up with is a signature that you can't verify or a key that you can't identify. So it just causes things to break, but it's the exact same as if you flip bits in the ciphertext or if you flip bits in a signature. It'll just fail to operate properly.
So Brian, this is Ed. A couple of quick things. Number one, thank you so much for writing this up. I think that having more than one security context and showing how you can accomplish a variety of things with the security context concept is important. It also, if we get implementations of this and the default, we can start doing things like sizing comparisons, processing comparisons, how easy it is to push through code in the BPAs. The last is there is a draft out for a security context template, and it might be good to look at how you formatted this document, how the default security context document was formed, to see if we can then work together on what would be a good template to give to other authors of other security contexts to make sure that the information is presented in a standard digestible way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have browsed that context template, and I agree that it's good to try to pull things in line with that. The only bit of a nuance in this case is that it's one context used in two different security blocks, which is probably not something that was originally looked at.
Agreed, and the template probably needs to be updated. But we did actually change BPSec itself to note that you could have one security context that covers both BIBs and BCBs.
Okay.
For that reason.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Any further questions from the floor? I'm watching the clock and conscious that other people still have to speak. Thanks, Brian. Right, so next up we have, I believe, Fred Templin, he says, jumping between the agenda very quickly. No, we don't. We have Sarah Heiner on BPSec security templates. Perfect timing. Security templates and policy. The slides are named subtly differently. Oh, there we go. Sarah, are you there?
Yes.
Is your microphone working? Yeah, you're a little bit quiet.
I will try to speak up,
That's
but
better.
let me know if anything is not coming across clearly. So I'll be conscious of time. So I'm Sarah Heiner. I'm going to present a little bit on security policy and also the security operation lifecycle. So if we can move to the next slide. So we'll start with a discussion of security policy for BPSec. We know that BPSec enables the representation of a security operation in a bundle as an extension block. And there's been some work done to determine what the life cycle of an extension block looks like. So you may have seen this in the security context template draft. We are representing the life cycle of that extension block as a series of events that's both finite and unchanging. And that life cycle captures events that are associated with both successful and unsuccessful block processing. So I want to share a little bit of a detailed look at that life cycle because it's security policy that determines the reaction to the occurrence of those events in the life cycle. And we need consistent reactions to those events to enable end-to-end security. So I feel that there's value in documenting the events in the block lifecycle as the processing points for policy. And that would give us a common language to use when discussing policy. So if we can move to the next slide. So I'm sure that we can agree that the use of a security protocol like BPSec alone doesn't provide end-to-end security. We also need that consistent security policy in place. Recall that BPSec requires the establishment of a security context for each security operation, since we aren't negotiating or maintaining session information in a DTN. Using that security context, we get syntactic interoperability for the network. So we can parse and decode bundles, and we can generate cryptographic material using that security context. But in order to derive meaning from that information, we need policy to provide semantic interoperability. So it's not enough to come across the correct cipher suite implementation for a security service. We also need the policy settings to be correct in order to process a block and verify the security service that it's representing. So we need both security context and policy in order to derive meaning from security services. Next slide, please. So we've defined security policy as the set of configurable reactions for a security operation event. It's those configurable actions that provide the consistent behavior that we need in response to both security successes and failures, which we're capturing as events in this life cycle. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, policy is what's establishing that critical context for security processing and provides meaning for the presence or the absence of security services. Next slide, please. So here we're moving into the life cycle itself. Recall that BPSec allows both a security operation and its associated security context to be represented as a block in the bundle. So that means that we can establish universal policy points by tracking that block lifecycle, which is what's shown here. The life cycle is a series of 13 events, and they're capturing successful and unsuccessful processing of the representation of a security operation. You'll see that it's divided into 3 distinct sections, and that captures the fact that the life cycle of a security operation is driven by the role of the processing node, with those roles being the security source, verifier, and acceptor. In the most basic case, a security operation would encounter 4 events. A node would have to be identified as the security source for that operation. It's required to be represented in the bundle. It would then move to being successfully represented in the bundle, arrive at its acceptor, and then be subsequently processed and removed from the bundle. There are, of course, more than 4 events shown here, and they're capturing the failures that could occur along the way for the processing of that security operation. Specifically, a security operation can be identified as missing, misconfigured, or corrupted. And identifying the different security failures allows us to configure security policy and take into account the severity of the event as well as the implications that it might have for security. Jumping into the last slide, please. So as a quick summary, I think that the work that's been done here to define the series of events in the security operation lifecycle would be valuable to standardize for BPSec. It would give us a common language to use when discussing and defining policy. And while we can't standardize the reaction to these events, as that's a matter of policy itself, it's beneficial to define the events themselves as they are the processing points for policy. So with that brief rapid fire presentation, if there are any questions or comments, I'd appreciate them. And if you'd rather take it to the mailing list as a matter of time, sounds good to me.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, really interesting stuff. An informational draft would be absolutely brilliant about this sort of thing. That would be great. I'm going to close the line. Comments on the list everybody, please. Thank you very much. Next, we have Fred Templin. Fred, if you're there. Let me just find some slides for you. Good news, Fred. So a little point of order. The last item we have is, after this slide, is a demonstration by Dave from APL, who has got some quite fun tools for playing with AMP, which is the asynchronous messaging. We're going to run long on this session, so we'll get Dave in after we have officially finished the session. So just our intention is to run long. I understand some people have to leave, but that does give Fred his 10 minutes, because this is another convergence layer and looks like it's really interesting stuff. So go ahead, Fred.
Okay, thanks, Rick. So the title of this is LTP fragmentation, but it really concerns anything that uses the UDP convergence layer. So let's go on to the next chart. So LTP provides a reliable datagram convergence layer for DTN bundle protocol. It's often configured over the UDP transport layer, and it inherits its maximum segment size from the maximum size UDP datagram that can be sent. The document discusses interactions with IP fragmentation and mitigations for managing the amount of IP fragmentation employed. And it applies to any UDP transport layer user, and not just LTP, anything that might use the bundle protocol over the UDP transport layer. Next chart, please. So the BP convergence layers, such as LTP, often use the UDP transport layer to break bundles into segments, as the largest atomic block of data the underlying data link layers must deliver it as a single unit. And it's also known as the retransmission unit. Each lost segment must be retransmitted in its entirety. So when UDP transport layer uses transmit a segment via send message, the send message system call, the UDP layer presents the resulting UDP datagram to the IP layer for transmission. The path maximum transmission unit, or the path MTU, reflects the smallest link MTU in the path from the sender to the receiver. UDP datagrams larger than the path MTU are broken into fragments using IP fragmentation. So, for example, if the segment size is 64K bytes and the path MTU is only 1280 bytes, IP fragmentation results in 50 plus fragments that are all transmitted as individual IP packets. And the IP fragment size then becomes known as the loss unit. So performance can suffer when the loss unit is significantly smaller than the retransmission unit. In other words, if even a single IP fragment is lost, then the entire segment must be retransmitted. Next chart, please. So when we use a UDP datagram size, for example, 64K bytes, that's larger than the path MTU, it has some advantages. First, the operating system can move larger quantities of data from user space to kernel space in a single send message system call. But once inside the kernel, IP fragmentation results in a burst of multiple fragment packets transmitted back to back as a result of a single system call. During these burst periods, the network utilization is high. So an IP fragment bursting can be good as long as there's minimal loss. But when the loss is significant, retransmission is required. And with IP version 4, undetected reassembly errors are also possible due to IP wraparound possibilities. So each successive send message system call results in an independent burst event. So the delay between successive system calls determines the network utilization. Next chart. In real-world networks, IP fragmentation may not be compatible with the lost properties of the path. So how do we achieve the benefits of bursting without making the lost unit smaller than the retransmission unit? So the answer is that some operating systems support what's known as the send multiple message system call, or send MM message. And that allows an application to present multiple segments to the kernel in a single system call. So for example, you might present 16 4K byte segments instead of just one 64K byte segment. And that enables the use of smaller segments without increasing the number of system calls. It provides the benefits of bursting while using smaller segment size. So that means that the loss unit can be made closer to the retransmission unit, so that loss of a single IP packet or fragment results in the retransmission of far less data. And we can even tune the amount of IP fragmentation allowed. We can have none, some, more IP fragmentation, or lots of IP fragmentation, while presenting multiple segments in a single system call to produce a burst of bursts. Next chart. So we have implemented this in the ION implementation and demonstrated its use. It allows for setting both the segment size, which is the UDP datagram size, and a burst limit. And preliminary performance results showed an increase in network utilization without causing receiver congestion. It can be made adaptive to control both the amount of IP fragmentation permitted and the number of segments presented to the kernel in a single system call. And further performance characterization efforts are underway. And I think that's the last of my charts, Rick.
Thanks, Fred. I was on mute, sorry. That's really interesting. I have one quick question, which is, no, I'll take it to the list. I'll take it because there's purely an implementation detail to do with Linux kernel optimization, but so that's fine. But really interesting to talk about the retransmission and packet subdivision. That hadn't really worked. I hadn't hit that one. That's really interesting. Thank you for that.
One point I'll say, Rick, is that the draft is currently expired, but I'm going to be reposting the draft in the next couple of days.
That would be great. Yeah, so that's should be of real interest to the working group. So have a look. Any other questions? Nope. Okay, so as I said earlier, we're going to slightly overrun because we've had a very busy schedule. I'm really pleased we've had a very busy schedule. But while I line up David Adell's slides, if
you don't mind, I will try to share my screen and just give a live demo.
Yeah. Go for it. Go for it. So we're going to run long. I understand if people have to quit out, but we'll try and run a little bit longer. David, you've probably got about 10 minutes before MeetEcho take the entire service down. But
Okay.
You should have permission to share.
Yep. All right. There we go.
Got it.
So I'm talking about the AmpMe tool, which is a prototype experimental tool that does a variety of things to help management and interfacing with Network Manager. So I'm going to show off a couple of things that it can do. It also is a prototype of showing off a lot of things that we could do with the UI in the future with many stubbed out features. So the main functionality of it is taking AMP messages and converting them between various formats. So over here, I've already pasted in a sample URI format. If I parse it, you see in the summary, it shows the input, it outputs it in CBOR format, back to the URI, and a variety of JSON, and also shows how it can re-encode into CBOR. Alternatively, I can pass it in CBOR encoded string, and it'll decode over here. You see it has each of the hex values, what the type is, and how it decodes. So this is very useful when doing implementations and debugging. In addition, there's a UML view, which breaks down the message into a very nice diagram, which is very helpful when trying to debug why an implementation isn't working. You'll notice in the URI format here for the hex, it is prefixed with a term here. ARI means this is an ARI message, You could also use message for an individual message report or messages for a message group. Currently, the Ion NM Manager will actually output in the debug that prefix when it receives traffic. So this entire interface is written actually in JavaScript. Right now, functionality I just shown was running entirely in the browser, but it's also designed so it can run in Node.js via the command line. So if I switch over here and scroll up, and I can run the same decommutation in the browser, in the command line. And 3. And this is for the CBOR version. So other capabilities that... Someone say something?
No, sorry, that was me.
Sure.
I should have muted my microphone.
No problem. So other capabilities you see here, it's showing a list of agents. Right now it is querying this both from the running network manager instance using the REST API that was included in the last release. And it is also querying the MySQL database and showing records in there. So this entry is only on the manager. It wasn't inserted in the database, primarily because the database was offline when I started the manager. So it's just showing the name. Here it's showing the name and database ID. This page is primarily a placeholder. As you can see, there are future tabs here for actually displaying reports and sending controls. All things that I hope we will add to it in the future. Last time I gave this demo, somebody commented that it would be useful to actually view some of the ADMs and controls. So there is an ADM listing view here. This shows all of the ADMs that are available. You can double click here to go to the IETF page with a raw definition, which of course might turn slow. Or you can double click anywhere else and it'll show you the raw JSON file, which the Node.js script here is actually using to control a lot of the parsing, and it's how it's able to decommutate some of the URIs. Let's see. Right. So one other thing I can show off. So as I said, this has command line tools as well. A lot of the SQL support is not in the web UI now. That's primarily just a matter of hooking up the logic. But there are scripts such as an insert message here, where I gave it here a URI format of a control, and it's inserted into the database and told me the ID. If my manager was actually running properly right now, it would parse it and send it out, and the response report would come back into the database. Right now, my connectivity isn't running, so we can't see the report. But if we did, there is also a show script here. In this case, I'm just showing the control that was sent, but the same command works for IDs of reports that were received as well. All of this is planned to be included in the next ION release, though as I noted, this is still experimental and not all data types will be working in the SQL database yet. And on the AmpMe side, while it should be able to decode everything from the hex CBOR format, I believe some URI syntax may not be complete.
So, David, as I understand it, this is effectively a prototype of functionality that one would have in a networks operations center for managing, in the loosest sense, a series of devices using AMP for management. So this is handling and decoding the messages from their heavily encoded form down to something manageable, understanding the reports, allowing humans to understand what on earth's going on, and see the traffic flow as well as the data itself. Is that right?
Correct. It is providing both a tool for developers in this AMP-me mode, where you put in more of the raw CBOR to help debug issues. And the intent is to also, as you say, in an operational point, you would have the database view to view more user-friendly forms.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
go ahead.
This is really it's really interesting work, and when we start talking about the concept of what does it mean to do asynchronous network management, the ION distribution as a reference implementation of bundle protocol and DTN protocols in general, you can use AMP to configure and run ION, to configure security, to configure LTP, to configure IPN and naming, and so on. And these kinds of utilities on the front side allow you to then start putting that into the text-based scripts, compiling them into the CBOR representation, and then sending them to agents that will implement them. And so it's as you do all of that, these kind of tools will become more. And there are a couple of projects and other organizations that are also starting to bring these tools together and release them open source.
Yeah, and the hope is that eventually a lot of these tools can work together to give a complete picture.
That's really
cool.
interesting.
And Dave, thank you for offering a live demo on short notice. I think that's a lot more interesting than slides.
Always. I know that was a rapid fire demonstration, but hopefully that was worth the extra 10 minutes into our overage.
Okay, so on that note, I think we've probably got to call it then because we have overrun. Thank you very much, all the presenters. Thank you very much, all the attendees. Whatever your time zone, I appreciate you making the effort. Yeah, so we're meeting again. It's a virtual interim in March, early March, I think 8th, 9th, something like that. We haven't got dates for the actual DTN session, but early March. Put in your diary, this will be happening again. Please look at the drafts that are in IESG review. Please keep an eye on the discuss resolutions that are happening. Please get feedback. Please provide feedback to the authors, because without confirmation from the working group, the authors aren't 100% sure that they are reflecting the opinions of the working group, and these are working group documents. Otherwise, Ed, do you want to add any final words?
Thank you to everyone that took excellent notes through all of this. I've been looking at the Cody MD site, and it is a terrific capture. And I noted that somewhere someone wrote "avoid madness," and I think that's probably the best note that I've seen. That's all I have.
We'll put that on the charter when we recharter. DTN, avoid madness. Otherwise, I think that, oh yes, one last thing. Obviously we now have a secretary slot open. I will put a message on the mailing list about this as well, but if you'd like to put your name forwards for working group secretary, we would be very interested to hear from you. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, night, whatever it is, wherever you are. And thank you very much. I think that's it. Bye all. I'm going to close my window.